Hi everyone, welcome to Biogeography Week 9. Congratulations on making it through the midterm. Not only in this class, but other midterms. Hope things are going well for you all. I'm about 2/3 of the way grading your midterms, and so far they look really good. I think you all are doing a really good job keeping up with the material in class. And I just want to encourage you to continue to watch the lectures and check in with each other and come to office hours and stay up on the material, and you'll just continue to do well. Okay. All right, so let's get started with today's lecture, this week's lecture. So we left off talking about some ecological terms, and I want to continue that theme by talking about another set of terms that are going to be really important for understanding biogeography, the science of biogeography, and describing environments. And the first term that I want to talk about today, continuing this section on ecological structure, is to talk about niche. And if you were in class, if we were in person in class, I would ask you, what's your definition of a niche? And many of you would say, or at least in past classes have said, that niche is where an organism lives and the resources that it uses. And that is a large portion of the definition of niche. The biotic and abiotic, the living and non-living resources involved in sustaining an organism in an environment. But the niche is not only about where an organism lives and the resources that it uses. It also includes the role that the organism plays, right? And so a niche is composed of what an organism takes from the environment and what resources are needed, but also what that organism gives to the environment, gives to the ecosystem. So within the concept of niche, there are two types of niches that we can talk about. We can talk about the realized niche of a given species or a given organism, and we can also talk about their fundamental niche. And the difference between these two is pretty straightforward. A realized niche of an organism is what is observed as their resources and their role within a given location, within a given environment, right? The fundamental niche is composed of their potential or their theoretical niche, what spaces they occupy, but also spaces and roles that they could occupy. So, to give an example of the difference between realized and fundamental niche, there was an experiment that was run by Joseph Cannell a number of years ago, in which he observed two barnacle species that lived in the same intertidal region, and he decided to determine whether or not the Cathalymus barnacle species, the one that's indicated in brown and at a higher level higher level above the water table, he decided to try to understand whether or not where he was observing Cathalymus, the realized niche of Cathalymus, whether or not that was the same as the fundamental niche of that particular species. And so in order to test this, he removed the Balanus species, the species that had more territory and occupied a space closer to the water and within the water. And what he found was that over time, Cathalymus, without having to compete with Balanus, occupied those territories that had been vacated by that other barnacle species. And so the graph, or the picture on the left, is an example of, or an illustration of, the realized niche of Cathalymus, that brown barnacle species. And what we see when we remove a competitor, that Cathalymus is able to move from its realized niche to its fundamental niche, right? The potential areas or the theoretical areas where that species could exist. Okay, so be on the lookout for a question like this on an exam, and remember that oftentimes the realized niche of an organism is more constrained than the fundamental niche because of other factors that we're going to talk about. Okay, so getting back to the definition of niche and what we're talking about, and to just drive the point home of the difference between niche and habitat, they're not interchangeable terms. And so habitat is an organism's address, right? And so, for example, your habitat as WVU students is sitting in front of your computer during this unique semester. But normally it's being on campus, right? It's being in Morgantown. It's being in these buildings. Your niche as a WV student is your role. So not only going to sporting events if you're into that sort of thing and socializing, but your role as a student, your niche as a student, is to be located in this space, at the university space, and to participate in higher education, right? So again, that's just driving the point home that niche and habitat are not the same thing. They're not interchangeable terms, okay? All right, so then when we talk about an organism's location, its resources, and its role in an environment, those elements are related to its distribution, where we find the organisms and where we don't find the organisms. So we can talk about distribution in terms of sink and source habitats. Now, source habitat is defined as where an organism or a population of organisms comes from. Our source habitats as people would be where we were maybe born and raised, which may or may not be different from where we're located right now, which is at the university. Sink habitats are areas that have been newly colonized by an organism. And the reason why they're called sink habitats is because there's often high mortality in these new environments. So a number of the members of a population that's moving to a new area suffer mortality. Their lives go down the drain in these habitats. And that's because there are all sorts of new factors. There may or may not be appropriate food sources in these new habitats. There may be new diseases or predators in these spaces, or not. These areas may not have the things that those newly colonizing organisms might have. Okay, and so source is where you're from. Sink is where you're newly arrived to. But in cases where there isn't high mortality in these sink habitats, that leads to the potential of an unrealized niche being found by this newly colonizing organism. And so an unrealized niche, an area where an organism who was previously not exposed to those resources in that role could eventually thrive, that happens when the population persists. And there's all sorts of examples of species moving from their source habitat to new habitats, and actually that new habitat being just as favorable or even more favorable for that organism. And so what we're talking about is invasive species, organisms in a new habitat, and they may take on a different role and be subject to different factors. So some examples of these invasive species. Here's a picture of one. And if you don't immediately recognize this, then this photo should drive it home for a lot of you. And so this is, drum roll, honeysuckle. And it's everywhere. You just have to walk around really anywhere in the sort of eastern and central Atlantic areas of the United States and North America, and you'll see this invasive plant. It was not, honeysuckle is not from this region. It was brought here, and it is come to an area where there's an unrealized niche, where they are actually doing much better here than they would be in their home environment. Another example of an invasive species is the giant snail. These snails are originally from East Asia, and they have been introduced to North America, and they don't have the same predatory pressures that they have in their home environment. The things that would normally predate these snails don't live in these areas, and so they are doing very well. Another example are pythons, particularly in the Florida Everglades. And a lot of these snakes are coming into the United States from outside, from Southeast Asia and other areas, through the pet industry. People wanting to own a python and get them as small snakes, and then those snakes continue to grow. And they release them into the wild because they are into the environment because they no longer are able to or want to care for them. And here's a a very large snake that would be a big challenge to anyone who is trying to keep that snake in their home. The last example, a real life example, is the snakehead fish, another species from East Asia that's doing very well since its introduction to North America. And I actually remember when it was possible to purchase these snakes at the pet store. I used to work at a pet store in middle school and high school. And you could buy snakehead fish and keep them in your aquarium, and people love them because they grew quickly and they're very voracious predators. But just like pythons, they grow too big for people to handle them, and then people release them into, creeks and lakes and rivers around where they live. And these fish are doing very well. They're thriving in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and causing a lot of problems because, as you can see, they have really big teeth. They're very aggressive fish. They grow very quickly. And another special feature that has allowed them to spread is the fact that they can survive out of water for extended periods of time. And so they can sort of flop from one, creek or stream to another, and continue to do very well. So they are causing a lot of issues for native species here in the United States and waterways as well. And so, these real life examples of, species being introduced to new environments are also reflected in science fiction. And so, here's a movie posters of two examples of the way in which invasive species sort of play out in the imagination of human beings, Cloverfield and War of the Worlds. And, I like these to compare these two, to juxtapose these two movies, because the outcomes of the species that come to Earth are different if you've seen both of these movies. At the end of Cloverfield, after this alien monster has wreaked havoc on New York City, it's decided by the government that they're going to drop a nuclear bomb on this alien species to try to prevent it. Everything else has failed. And you find out at the end that, sorry, spoiler alert, that the nuclear bomb doesn't work, that it has no effect on the alien species that has found us on planet Earth. And so, this is an example of an invasive species that's found an unrealized niche. The things that would limit its spread, maybe in whatever home environment it came from, are not present on planet Earth. And so, it spells doom for humanity. In the War of the Worlds remake, because this is originally a story that was told by Orson Welles, the aliens, come to Earth and wreak havoc. But eventually they die because the microbes on planet Earth are deadly to them. And so it just takes a while for the aliens to succumb to the microbes that we normally live and breathe with, to take care of the aliens. And so it's sort of a happy ending for humanity in this case. And then just a interesting story about this, about War of the Worlds. It was, like I said, it was originally a story by Orson Welles, and it was told over the radio back in the day when there weren't any televisions, and when people, instead of gathering around the TV to watch a program in prime time, people would gather around the radio to listen to stories that were told over the radio, kind of like listening to an audiobook. And the story of War of the Worlds starts out like a news broadcast that's explaining like these strange objects are popping up out of the ground, and these creatures are causing havoc. And when people first heard this story, they didn't think it was a story. They thought it was real, because I think it started out with, "We interrupt your regularly scheduled program to tell you that aliens have come to Earth." And so when the story was originally told over the radio, people freaked out and, were calling the police and calling the local government. And they had to I think they had to interrupt the original broadcast to tell people that this wasn't real, because people were really freaking out. Okay, so real life imitated in art is always a thing, and so be on the lookout for some of the things that we talk about in this class, and maybe some of your movies if you're into like science fiction and the like. Okay, so when we think about distribution and the things that limit species and limit populations in particular areas, there are ways that we can explain that limitation of geographic range. And, as Western scientists often want to do, we come up with these sort of laws or principles or concepts that are helpful in explaining what we are observing. So the Hutchinson's multidimensional niche concept states that the abundance and distribution of organisms is the result of multiple different factors, right? So it's not just, one or two things. It's not just temperature. It's not just food availability, but it's a sort of a complex interaction of things. It's a complex issue. Then Liebig's law of the minimum states the opposite, that the distribution is often due to one or two primary factors. That is, in fact, not necessarily such a complex issue. It's food, it's water availability, it's access to mates, and those sorts of things. And so the question in all of these becomes, which one of these principles or concepts is correct? And there certainly are cases where Liebig's law of the minimum is the case. A thing that the one of the primary things that limits, let's say, Burmese pythons from, colonizing, Alaska is the fact that it gets really cold and that Burmese pythons are not well adapted to the cold. So there are cases where the minimum is the case, or that the one or two factors are the case. But as human beings are beginning to understand the environment and the interactions in the environment a bit better, we are beginning to see. We are beginning to see that these issues are more complex. In the same way that we're beginning to see that our genetic makeup and what causes our traits and features as human beings and also in other species is not just one issue. When the human genome, or not just one gene, when the human genome was originally being mapped, we were thinking that we would find discrete genes for discrete characteristics, right? There would be one gene for, how you laugh, and one gene for, your hair color, one gene for this and one gene for that. But in fact, as we are learning more, we are discovering that it's much more complex than a one-for-one sort of representation within your genetic code for the traits that you see. It's an interaction of these different things. And so as we learn more about the environment and the limits of geographic range, we're discovering that Hutchinson's multidimensional niche concept is more appropriate than this idea that it's one or two primary factors. So just keep that in mind as we talk about these relationships. And so to talk a little bit more about the things that limit geographic range, some of these discrete things, one of the biggest factors is solar radiation in terms of limiting the distribution of different species. And that is related to temperature, moisture, wind, and the organism's ability to metabolize energy, to metabolize the things that it needs to survive. And so, these factors were worked out by Western scientists through a series of timberline studies, and this photo is an example of this. And so as you move up in elevation on this mountain, you can see that the vegetation and the landscape changes, and that's due to these different abiotic environmental factors like temperature, moisture, wind, and then an organism's ability to metabolize nutrients. And so as elevation increased, it was correlated with vegetation pattern, just why, at northern latitudes of the globe and then at higher elevations, you don't see these large trees, these large structures, because it becomes difficult to maintain those large structures because there's not as much energy at these higher elevations and these higher latitudes. There's not as much solar radiation at higher latitudes on the globe. And then temperature becomes an issue, and being able to manage things like frost and heat loss. And so these studies are really important. These are really important observations for describing the distribution and geographic range of species. Another thing that limits the distribution of the geographic distribution of species is disturbance. And disturbance is very important for explaining species distribution. And, species depend on disturbance, both in the short term and in the long term for their survival. Certainly for Homo sapiens, 65 million years ago, there was a very big disturbance on the planet that gave rise to mammals proliferating on the planet. There were mammals present at the time of the dinosaurs, but we were a very sort of new group of organisms, and of course, dinosaurs dominated the planet. And without that meteor impact, it's very likely that dinosaurs would continue to dominate the planet. But that was a disturbance that led to big changes in the ecological makeup. Another organism, sort of thinking in the immediate short term, are organisms that depend on fire for their germination. And so these are jack and lodgepole pines. And these pine cones that you see here in this picture actually won't open unless they're exposed to fire. And so that indicates that these species evolved in a landscape that experienced regular fires, and it would be advantageous for a pine cone to stay closed until there is a fire that moves through, because fire makes a lot of nutrients available, makes a lot of soil nutrients available. And so it would be advantageous for after a fire moves through a landscape that a pine cone would open and release its seeds, and then new pine trees can sprout. And so it's a really neat example of co-evolution, and that these cones require fire to release and open and release their seeds. So, we can also think of the human impacts and really settler colonial impacts of fire regimes, and thinking about what's happening in the western part of what's now considered the United States with these large and dangerous and really destructive fires. And that's the result of a long history of fire suppression by the U.S., by the United States, which followed an even longer history of indigenous people living on the landscape in a very different way that sought not to prevent any and all fires, but recognized that fires were helpful and useful for their own purposes, but also helpful and useful for the other species that were living there. But when the United States government decided that indigenous people didn't have a right to their lands and kicked them off their lands or killed them off their lands, you saw a very different environmental policy that is the result of that resulted in these large fires that we're dealing with today. And essentially what happens is when you suppress any and all fires on the landscape, you allow the biomass, the sort of smaller plants, to build up. And those smaller plants eventually burn, and there's more fuel then for the fires that are regularly occurring on this landscape to burn. And so that's why we have really, really intense and now more frequent fires in California and the western part of the country, because for decades and even centuries, these forest communities have developed in a way that make them essentially a bonfire, whereas when indigenous people were managing the lands, the fires were a lot smaller and a lot less destructive. Okay, so we've got bigger, longer, hotter, more environmentally damaging fires because of the very rapid change in the way the ecosystem functions. So what happens when there is disturbance is that you get a process called succession, in which essentially the slate of the biotic community is either wiped completely clean, in which case we would be at the stage all the way to the left, which is bare rock, or wiped partially clean, where you can be anywhere between the next three stages, in which different plants and organisms begin colonizing those environments. And another thing to note, in addition to the increase above the soil of the plants that we get in a community over time, we also get an increase in the soil, the amount of soil that's in the environment. And that has to do with different classes of organisms living and dying and becoming part of the soil and making other nutrients available. The other thing to note here is that this process of succession can take hundreds, if not thousands, of years, which makes, fires and any sort of rapid environmental change, really, really unfortunate, because you have, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years of community function gone very, very quickly. And it takes a very long time for those things to come back. And so, then the question becomes, well, is disturbance good or bad? And you better believe this will be a question on your final exam. And so, some human populations love to ask this question, particularly settler colonial populations, because so much of the way in which culture in this country is structured is that things are either good or bad, right? There's not as much nuance to those questions. But in the case of disturbance from a biological standpoint, the answer is yes. Is disturbance good or bad? Yes. Meaning that it depends on how the ecosystem functions, right? It depends. Sometimes disturbance is good, right? Environments are complex. There's some members of the ecological community that would benefit from disturbance, and there's others that would be harmed by disturbance. And so, the negative unintended consequences of trying to answer this question with good or bad, or yes or no, is the result, or results in, things like increased fires and a lot of ecological problems in an area. It's a false dichotomy. The answer to this question isn't disturbance good, is all disturbance is good or all disturbance is bad. The answer is it depends. And we have to answer that question. And fire suppression is an example of people trying to answer this question one way or the other when the answer is both. Okay, so disturbance, good or bad? Yes. It's good for some, it's bad for others. It just depends. All right, so let's continue and talk about organism interactions. And these interactions also contribute to species distribution. If we think back to the barnacle example, the reason why Cathalamys's realized niche was geographically and spatially smaller than its fundamental niche, it was because of the interaction that Cathalamys was having with the other barnacle species. Okay, and so we can think about organism interactions as intraspecific or interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition are interactions between members of the same species. Okay, so we can talk about things like competing for mates or competing for food amongst members of the same species. And versus interspecific competition is interactions between, or competition between, members of different species. And so the interactions that we observed with Cathalamys and Balanus barnacles, that's an example of interspecific competition, because they're two different species and they're interacting with each other. Another example of just competing for space is also predation. All right, so let's talk about competition. And there are two main types of competition that I want to talk about, and then give a specific example and give a term for that. And the first type of competition is exploitative competition. So if you've seen the movie that this screenshot is from, then you know what the reference to milkshake is. And so this is a screenshot from the movie There Will Be Blood, which is a really long sort of speculative fiction book about the history of oil tycoons in what's now the Midwest and Southwest United States. And it follows this character here, and I forget his name in the movie, who is a aspiring oil capitalist, and he's one of the first entrepreneurial white Americans who ventures out into the Wild West and discovers oil and builds his massive empire. And there's a scene in the movie where he's talking to a competitor about drinking his milkshake as a way to access resources on or under land that the competitor owns. And so he figured out that he could drill sort of sideways on his own land that was adjacent to this competitor and essentially suck the oil from underneath that person's land and use it as his own. And this is a great example of the development of the legal concept of mineral rights. And that kind of hits home for folks here in Appalachia and in fracking zones. And if you know anything about mineral rights, those are really important in order to either make money from the resources that are underneath the land that you own, or to prevent companies from accessing your land and using those resources, if that's something that you didn't want to do, right? And so, around this time that this movie takes place, it was a debate about whether or not what it meant to own land. And whether or not that meant the surface of the land and everything underneath, or whether or not it meant just the surface of the land. And of course, we know what the result of that was. That it was determined that there's a difference between surface rights and mineral rights. And so this example of companies buying up land adjacent to an area and drinking the milkshake, or extracting the resources underneath the surface land that someone owns is an example of exploitative competition. And that's simply using up the resources of a competitor so that the competitor doesn't have any of those resources anymore. And in this movie, this oil tycoon bankrupted their competitor, who had not figured out that this is what they were doing. So it's a really kind of sneaky and effed up way to compete with a competitor. So another example of competition is interference competition. And this is a difference because it involves direct interaction of competitors. And so it's aggressive behavior towards a competitor, inhibiting a competitor from using resources. So rather than kind of sneakily stealing someone's resources or taking someone's resources so they have none, an example of this would be physically intimidating another competitor so that they don't access resources, right? So as opposed to, let's say, a fracking company using up the natural gas underneath the land that you owned, it would be the fracking company sending goons to your house and saying, you're going to give up those resources, or we're going to take these resources, or else. Okay, so that's interference competition. And so an example of this, not in fiction and not in the human world, but in the plant and animal world, is a term called allelopathy. And it is the chemical inhibition of a competitor. And if you might recognize this photo as a picture of a black walnut tree. And if you've ever observed a mature black walnut tree, you might have noticed that there are not a lot of smaller plants and trees that grow underneath or within the canopy space, the soil canopy space of a black walnut tree. And that's because this species of tree puts chemicals into the ground that prevent the growth and inhibit the growth of other plant species. And so it's nice for human beings who like to lay underneath a walnut tree because there's not a lot of other like smaller trees or different species that are there. But not so nice for other organisms, other plant organisms within the community that might want to live in that particular space. Okay, so that's interference competition. An example of that is allelopathy, and it's direct or aggressive behavior towards a competitor to prevent them from accessing resources. So when we think about competition and competition over time, there is a principle called the competitive exclusion principle, and it states that two species that have the same niche, right, the same habitat and the same role cannot coexist forever, right? And that eventually one competitor has an advantage, and that advantage will play out to the extinction of the competitor that doesn't have that same advantage. And so there are lots of examples of species that have very similar niches and are competing. But resource partitioning is a way for those two species to coexist. And what happens in this case is that it's an escape from the competitive exclusion principle, in which species adapt slightly different resources or slightly different roles or slightly different behaviors that allows them to coexist in the same habitat and closely with other organisms without going extinct. And so there are two examples here. One is of lions and hyenas. And that photo that's covered up by the photo of the bird here is of Mufasa attacking the hyenas in The Lion King. And the question becomes, like, lions and hyenas have coexisted for a very long time. They're both top predators, very successful hunters. They eat the same animals, and so the question becomes, why hasn't one species gone extinct? And the reason for that is because hyenas have adapted to eat slightly different parts of the same animals that lions feed on, particularly the bones of prey species. And so that's one way that hyenas have been able to coexist with lions that are larger and pound for pound could kill a hyena. And it's a really neat adaptation. And so the hyena's jaws are actually stronger and have more bite force than lions. And lions don't eat bones. They primarily eat the soft bits of the prey that they eat. And when the lions are done, then oftentimes the hyenas come and clean up the bones. Also, it's a common misconception that hyenas are scavengers and that lions are hunters. In fact, lions do far more scavenging than hyenas do. And that's because lions are the biggest, predator on the landscape. And so they oftentimes wait for hyenas to bring down a prey animal. And as a pride, they go and they bully hyenas off the prey, eat their fill, and then the hyenas come and eat what's left over. So we oftentimes, think like, hyenas are sneaky and not noble and lions are noble, but in fact it's the opposite. Lions are quite lazy and they steal far more food from smaller predators than they do hunting of their own. Another example of resource partitioning in birds is this photo here of a bearded vulture. And I have a video of, I will have a video of the bearded vulture on eCampus. And so I want you all to take a look at that. And it's a really neat example of resource partitioning in which a vulture species is able to survive by essentially eating bones, where other scavenging birds don't do the same thing. So it's an example of this in birds. But it's a really cool video about how a bird that doesn't have strong enough beaks to break open bones and eat the nutritious marrow inside, how they're able to do that. So take a pause and watch that video and then come back. Pretty cool, right? All right. So when we think about competitive exclusion and resource partitioning, we also have examples of that in our genus Homo. And so, we begin to sort of think about what happened to the Neanderthals. And so here's a photo of two hominid skeletons. The one on the left is Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthal. And the one on the right is Homo sapien. And you can see the sort of physical characteristic differences between the two hominid species, Neanderthals being shorter, but also broader and sort of more robust. And so Neanderthals are close cousins of ours. And we both descended from Homo erectus. But Neanderthals went extinct about 28,000 years ago. There really isn't a trace of their discrete populations within the anthropologic record. And so, it is very likely that Neanderthals were excluded by Homo sapiens. But, Western science used to think that Homo sapiens sort of killed off all the Neanderthals and, destroyed them and just hunted them. But the evidence of that is not as strong as the evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens formed family groups and interbred. And in fact, there are markers of Neanderthal DNA in living populations today. It's very likely that many of us, or some of us in this class, have markers of Neanderthal DNA because Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lived in the same area and formed social groups and family groups together. But as a discrete sort of population, a discrete species, they no longer exist. Okay, so the question becomes like, why are they no longer around? And we're still trying to figure that out. And certainly there was conflict between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but it wasn't all blood and gore. All right, so in thinking about moving from competition to predation, predation is the basis for some really, really neat adaptations that we observe amongst animals and plants. And so there is a hypothesis within the relationship of predation called the life-lunch hypothesis. And the life-lunch hypothesis explains why prey are generally better adapted to escape predators than predators are adapted to catch their prey. So stated another way, that prey more often than not escape predators, and that predators more often than not don't catch their prey. And the reason for this general trend is because of the differential cost of failure, right? If prey were less successful at escaping predators than predators were of catching prey, then the prey would not survive for a very long time. And so, because prey need to get away to live, and that if a predator misses an opportunity to eat, they don't die. They simply go hungry for a period of time until they are successful in catching a prey item. So the cost of failure is the reason why prey are better adapted to escaping than predators are to catching them. A predator goes hungry for a while, whereas the prey has permanent death. And I'm being cheeky by saying permanent death, right? Because death is permanent. So the life-lunch hypothesis is essentially the predator loses its lunch if it fails, but if the prey fails, it loses its life, right? So we're all pointing to the cost of failure. Two really neat predator adaptations in the animal kingdom are represented in one, this scene from Finding Nemo, and then this real-life nightmare photo of a black mamba. And I have videos for at least one of these. Yes, I have a video for the black mamba, but I'll talk about the screenshot from Finding Nemo and the anglerfish here. And you can see there are a number of predator adaptations in this species. The most obvious may be the humongous and pointy teeth of this organism, of this fish. But the other, of course, is the light. The bioluminescent sort of lure that dangles right in front of the mouth of this fish. And so, the bioluminescent light, if you've seen the movie, is an attractant to species, potential prey species. They think that, this might be a source of food, or just something that's very interesting, and then all of a sudden, they become a snack. The long, sharp teeth that you see on this fish are also an adaptation for holding on to prey once you catch it. And so a lot of deep sea organisms have these kind of like spearing shaped teeth. And that's important because these species live in the dark. And so whatever prey you come across, you need to skewer in order for it to stay. in your vicinity, because you don't have time, you can't spend time or energy looking for chunks of your prey that might fall off. And so we contrast this with like shark species, which oftentimes have serrated, sort of broader teeth that are designed to shred and tear. And they live in environments where it's easy to see chunks of prey that might, fall in the water. So spearing your prey is not as important as immobilizing or as tearing it apart so you can eat it. As for the black mamba, you can see that, well, it's just a terrifying snake. There are not many organisms that will that I am scared of, but the black mamba is one of them. And if you should watch the video, you'll understand why. But I'll explain that the black mamba is one of the most deadly snakes in the world, if not the most deadly snake in the world. And it's not because its venom is the most potent. It's actually not the most potent, although one bite from a black mamba would kill a human being several times over. But aside from this snake having really toxic venom, it's very aggressive. It is the fastest snake in the world on the ground. It can slither at about 12 miles an hour if it wants to, which is very, very fast. And it's also the second longest venomous snake in the world. Can grow up to 14 feet. And so, this snake is just a nasty piece of business. But venom in and of itself is a spectacular predatory adaptation. And the reason why some organisms are some organisms' venom is very toxic is because they live in environments where, just like the anglerfish, they can't afford to be chasing their prey all over an environment, because they might lose it to a competitor, or they might in and of themselves become prey by chasing down the prey that they are trying to get. And so they need some sort of mechanism to quickly kill their prey so that they can swallow it and then be on their way. And one of those ways that they do that is by venom, highly toxic venom that will kill small rodents and prey items that they would be after in a matter of minutes, if not a matter of seconds. And so that's another predator adaptation. But of course, there are also prey adaptations, right? Ways that prey avoid becoming food. And one of those is by bright colorations, by advertising their deadliness. And here is a picture of a poison dart frog. And we see this sort of bright coloration as a signal to potential predators that I am not something that you want to eat. And in fact, many poison dart frogs have highly, highly, highly toxic poison that deters would-be predators from eating them. And so when you see this coloration, you know that this is not something that you want to really mess with, in the same way that when you see the black and yellow stripes of any flying organism, you sort of like, oh, I don't know if I want to touch that, because they might have something in store for me that I don't like. One important side note here is the difference between poison and venom. All right, and this is something that oftentimes people use interchangeably, but it's not the case. You notice that I didn't say a poisonous snake. I said a venomous snake. And I didn't say that this frog is a venom frog. It is a poison frog. And so the difference between venom and poison is this little mnemonic device. If it bites you and you die, then it's venomous. If you bite it and you die, it's poisonous, right? So poisons are things that are ingested, whereas venoms are things that are injected. Okay, and so that's just sort of like a little tidbit for this class, that if you learn nothing else, then you know that there's a difference between poison and venom. So one strategy is to be open and advertise your danger, but another is to try to blend in. And you can see here a picture of a frog that looks just like a leaf. And so oftentimes a strategy of blending in and camouflage is taken by organisms that don't have poison or are not particularly dangerous. They are hoping to hide from would-be predators. And so different strategies that are there. And then, of course, zebras, which don't ride motorcycles to escape lions. But, we have a case where we have an organism that is very conspicuously colored, but zebras aren't poisonous, and they're, they can be dangerous for predators, but they're not especially dangerous for lions. So the question becomes, well, why have this coloration? And the reason why zebras are colored the way that they are is because, or an example of why that is in this photo here. When you put a whole bunch of zebras together, it becomes very difficult to single out any particular zebra. The bodies and rumps and heads and shoulders of all these zebras sort of blend in together. And so that's a way of being conspicuous, but not because of, danger, not because of an inherent danger in the organism, but being conspicuous, but also confusing. So oftentimes when large predators hunt zebras, lions like to select, a weak or a young zebra. But if the zebras are together and moving around like this, it becomes very difficult for the lions or any predator to sort of distinguish between one and the other. So that's another strategy of being conspicuous but not deadly, and trying to be confusing. So, another prey adaptation can be seen in a photo that you might have seen, or that I had in one of the previous slides. And so I asked the question, how many of you all thought that this photo here, and the one that was from a couple of slides ago, was the head of a snake? And I really lament the fact that we're not in person in this case, because this is not actually the head of a snake. It is a caterpillar. And so right now we were in class, and I'm sure many of you, or a number of you right now, are like, what? No way. And so another prey adaptation is to mimic a predator. And so the back end of this caterpillar looks like the head of a snake. And this is a way that this caterpillar deters predators from eating it. What an incredible predatory or prey adaptation, right? I told you this stuff was cool, all right? So speaking of mimicry, that's a really important concept when we're talking about these species. And so with mimicry, there are two types that I need you all to know for this class. And the first is Batesian mimicry. It was named after the scientist who described this type of mimicry. And when Batesian mimicry occurs, a harmless organism mimics a harmful organism. And so the previous slide that we just had, right, this prey adaptation in a caterpillar species, or really a moth species, is an example of Batesian mimicry. The caterpillar is harmless. There's no poison. It doesn't actually have any venom. It's not, the head of a snake. But it is hoping that predators aren't able to tell the difference, or aren't willing to risk trying to attack the head of a snake. It will just move on. So that's an example of a harmless organism mimicking a harmful organism, or Batesian mimicry. The other example is Mullerian mimicry, named after Muller, who coined this type of mimicry. And this is where harmful mimics mimic each other, right? So from an evolutionarily speaking, this doesn't actually happen sort of in the way that I'm about to describe it. But evolutionarily, different species that are harmful over time evolve a similar color pattern, or a similar display of advertising their harm. And so it becomes a lot easier for predators or would-be predators to understand that message, rather than having a bunch of different color patterns or a bunch of different ways of advertising one's harm. Okay, so to bring this back, to give examples, so another example of Batesian mimicry is here between these two snake species. Now, one of these snake species is a highly venomous snake, and the other is harmless. And some of you all may know which is which. So maybe take 10 seconds to guess in your own mind, if you don't know, which one of these is a coral snake and which one of these is a corn snake, or a king snake. So if you guessed that A is a coral snake, a relative of the cobra, and venomous and harmful, then you'd be correct. All right. So a way to remember this, there are lots of different mnemonic devices for this, is if red touches yellow, you're a dead fellow. If red touches black, you're all right, Jack or Mac. And you can see that both of these snakes have a red, black, and yellow color pattern, but that in the case of the coral snake, red is always next to yellow, and in the case of this king snake, red is always next to black, right? But you can imagine that human predators or humans, but also other predators, would not be able to necessarily recognize that pattern. And even, if you are sort of running around or going on a trail run in the southwestern part of the United States where both of these snakes live, and you saw them and you knew that one of them was venomous, you probably wouldn't stop to see and make sure, wait, red and yellow, red and black, which one it is. You'd probably just keep moving. And, in the case of the natural environment, good enough, it will do just fine. Okay. And so this non-venomous king snake has evolved to mimic the pattern of the venomous coral snake to its advantage, right? So that's another example of Batesian mimicry. So an example of Mullerian mimicry is we can find in poison dart frogs. And here are different species that live in different geographical locations in Central America. And you can see that their color patterns aren't exactly the same, but they all involve some sort of combination of blue, green, yellow, contrasted with black, right? And so, if you were a predator and you ate one of these, or you tried to eat one of these species and you got really sick, you came across a different species that had a similar color, you probably wouldn't, taste it to make sure that it wasn't deadly. You sort of get the message across a bunch of different species, in the same way that you wouldn't be too careful, or you wouldn't take a whole lot of time to tell the difference between these two species. And so you can see that mimicking color patterns or behaviors or physiology of harmful organisms becomes advantageous if you are also harmful, or if you are harmless. But the thing about Batesian mimicry is that it only works if there are more members of the harmful community than the harmless mimics. And the question is why? Why do there need to be more coral snakes than king snakes in an environment in order for the king snake to take advantage of that mimicry? Well, of course, that goes to the message needs constant reinforcement, right? Individual predators live and they die, and they don't always pass on that knowledge. And so, there are going to be a new generation that has to learn that lesson. There might be some particularly hard-headed individual predators who need that constant reinforcement. And so if there were many more king snakes than coral snakes, then predators wouldn't come across enough actual harmful organisms to have that message be reinforced. Okay, and so the message is reinforced. The mimicry or the color pattern or whatever pattern that's signaling danger has to be reinforced by more harmful organisms. Okay, all right, almost done. But I want to talk about symbiotic relationships. When we're talking about symbiotic relationships, we're talking about one organism always benefiting. Okay. And so whenever two organisms are living sort of together in a relationship, that's the definition of a symbiotic relationship. One organism is always benefiting. But what distinguishes different types of symbiotic relationships is what happens with the other organism. And so when we're talking about parasitism, then while one organism is benefiting, the other organism is negatively impacted by that relationship. When we're talking about commensalism, while one organism is benefiting, the other organism is neutrally impacted. Like, it's not good necessarily or bad for that other organism. And when we're talking about mutualism, while one organism is benefiting, the other organism is also benefiting within that relationship. Okay? So it's important to remember this, and this will probably be a question on the exam, that a symbiotic relationship doesn't mean a mutualism. It means just the fact that there are two different species, or two different organisms of different species living in a relationship. How that relationship is going, whether or not both are benefiting or one is neutrally impacted and one is negatively impacted, is how we describe parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. Okay, so some examples of this, and we'll go back to science fiction. Here is a picture of a xenomorph from the series of movies Aliens, and this is a very clear example of a parasitism, right? This alien species needing a human host to grow, and once it grows to a certain size, it bursts out of the chest of the human being. And as terrifying as this fictional, hopefully these organisms do not exist anywhere. As terrifying as these fictional characters are, a lot of their characteristics were taken from the animal kingdom. And so if you know about this species, they have this mouth, but then they also have this sort of protruding mouth that comes from inside, and that characteristic was taken from moray eels and other organisms that have this thing called a pharyngeal jaw. They have a set of teeth sort of set back in their throats that are really helpful for grasping prey and holding on to them into the throat and esophagus of the organism. So pretty terrifying. I have a video of this, of some of you all might know a tarantula hawk. And this is a wasp species that where the females will actually sting and paralyze a tarantula, and then drag said tarantula to their burrow and lay an egg on the tarantula, and the egg hatches and then eats the tarantula alive. So that's another example of an organism that was used to create this terrifying hopefully fictional alien species. So click on or click on the video on eCampus about tarantula hawks. They are real life terror. Another example of the pharyngeal jaw that was used in the Alien series is this photo from the movie Prometheus. Okay, and so these examples, or this example of the tarantula hawk and the tarantula, is an example of a parasitism, right? The tarantula hawk is definitely benefiting from this relationship, and the tarantula is definitely negatively impacted by this. And so the venom of the tarantula hawk doesn't kill the tarantula, it just paralyzes it and keeps it alive until its babies eat the tarantula. An example of a commensalism, where one organism is benefiting and the other one is neutrally impacted, not negatively or positively impacted, is in this photo of I think that's a bull shark, and remoras, these fish that have suction cups that on the top of their heads that they use to attach to a shark. And I also have a video of this, so make sure you take a look at that throughout the course of the lecture. And the remoras hitch a ride onto a shark, and that suctioning doesn't harm the shark really in any way. And because sharks are very messy eaters, if these remoras stick around with the shark, they'll get a meal. There'll be lots of chunks of food that they can feed on. And so this is a great example of a commensalism. All right, so finishing up on organism interactions, we can think about an ecological community in terms of keystone species. Many of you all have heard about or know about keystone species, and those species are ones that are part of a community, that if they are removed, or that their presence has a strong impact on the structure of the community, and that if they are removed, there are big ecosystem changes if they were to decline or disappear. And there are lots and lots of examples of keystone species in human communities and human controlled ecosystems in this part of the world. Corn is a keystone species. It was domesticated by human beings, and some have argued that corn, in the process of being domesticated Homo sapiens. But corn has been, for millennia upon millennia, a keystone species for human communities and human culture and human economies in this part of the world. So the decline of varieties of corn will certainly have an impact on human species. Another example of this are wolves. They are a keystone species in many environments. Part of the reason why deer populations are so high in areas like West Virginia and the eastern part of the United States is because these keystone predators that were keeping those populations in check are gone. We don't have wolves roaming around most of North America like we used to, or like used to be here. And there are lots of studies that show that with wolf reintroductions, the ecosystems, particularly in Yellowstone and different areas, have begun to resemble what they did before European colonization. And there makes space for greater diversity of plant species and animal species. And so wolves are really important for balancing out the ecosystem. So 2 examples of keystone species. All right. And so the last example that I want to talk about sort of continues this discussion about keystone species, and it's predator-mediated coexistence. Right? So this idea that the persistence of species is heavily influenced by predators. And so one thing that happened when wolves disappeared from landscapes, particularly in the western part of this country, we saw crashes in populations of elk. We had these big explosions of these species because their predators were no longer around, and then eventually the crash of that population, they exceeded their carrying capacity, and there weren't enough resources to sustain these explosive populations. So that's a really important concept, that these keystone species play a role, and all organisms play a role. And when that role is removed by the local extinction or taxonomic extinction of an organism, then big changes happen to an ecosystem. That could be beneficial for some species, but could also not be beneficial for some species. So the last thing I'll leave you with is a really creepy example of predator-mediated coexistence, in which increases in a prey species result in a really ghastly appearance and proliferation of a predator species. And so this picture here of this woman who's holding her head like she has a headache will become apparent when you watch the video of the cordyceps fungus and its impact on ant species and ant populations and other insect species that become highly densely populated. Okay, so that's all I have for this week. I won't have a question of the week because this lecture is being posted on a Thursday. So take the time to review the notes, to look at the lecture, look at the slides, and then we'll pick up on our regularly scheduled programming on Monday, and I'll have the lecture for you on Monday. Question of the week, and another podcast and reflection for you all to do. Okay, so if there are any questions about where we're at, your grades, not only your midterm grades, but the other assignments that you submitted will be up by Friday, so you can talk to me about that. And please do, if there are concerns about the exam or how it was tallied and that sort of thing, then come to office hours and we can have a discussion about that. Okay. All right. I hope you all have a good weekend. And I will talk to you on Monday.